Hey all, it's Dinosaur again, and it's getting pretty late, I know, but I have another review I have to do. I was asked to go watch a movie called Black Nativity, and this movie was starring Forrest Whitaker and I think Angelica Bassett, I believe. Those are the two big stars on there. And I admit I was a little reluctant to see this movie because I've been getting kind of holiday movie down, so I was just like, oh man, here's another one. But I was actually pleasantly surprised is that the plot was actually quite good. It had to do with a 15-year-old in another city, African American child, trying to live in where he felt he belonged with his mother. And then what happened is the mother was getting evicted. She was losing her job. She wasn't getting paid enough to pay for the home and everything. So the mother made a decision to send the kid to Harlem with her grandparents. And her grandparent, well, not her grandparents, his grandparents. So the kid has never been in New York, never really knew about these grandparents, never knew any of this information, just sent them. Okay. And what the whole thing about, the whole title was Black Nativity. Now, when I saw the whole thing, I thought it had to do with the Nativity of Christ, and it really didn't. It had to do with telling the story. But what it had to do in this film, because it was also based on a Broadway show, which, again, usually Broadway shows and movies don't translate well. This one was okay. This actually translated pretty well on that overall because Forrest Whitaker actually did a really good job as a reverend. He was kind of believable as a reverend. He did that good of a job. And he told, welcomed. At first, he didn't recognize him because he looked like a punk. He was wearing a beanie cap, little earrings. He didn't look anything like they expected. And the Reverend, who lives in Harlem, is quite well off. He's driving a brand new Cadillac sedan, but he preaches to the congregation. Now, I don't remember any reverends I know driving around brand new Cadillacs, but, you know, whatever, it's a movie. So here's the thing. It could just be product placement at the same time. But here's the interesting thing. They send this kid, and this kid is completely a fish out of the water. He doesn't know New York. He gets off the bus, and he gets robbed within minutes of being there. And then he tries to find a phone to call his parents. He's out of money. And then he goes to the hotel asking to use a phone. They said it's for guests. You're not welcome here. So then what happens is a guy leaves his wallet on the counter. And the kid considers stealing the wallet, but then turns around and gives the wallet to the guy, or tries. And next thing you know, he's in jail for robbery. Which is typical New York on that, but the thing is, it'll be disproven in video review. They'll look at the videotape and see that the kid tried to hand the wallet to him and the guy overreacted. With that part of the story, remember, this is a story. So anyway, kid goes to his grandfather's house, which is the Reverend. Grandfather said, my son isn't a thief, and my grandson isn't a thief, and he told him I wasn't stealing it, I was trying to give it back to him, and the next thing I know, I'm in here. So they go back to this nice place in New York, I guess in Harlem, what this reverend does is preaches to the whole community, so the whole community knows who he is. And then as the son is there, he tries to befriend the grandson to show him some things. And one of the things he showed him was a pocket watch that had the initials CC from MLK, which was Martin Luther King. And then the kid, reverting to his other neighborhood, gets this crazy idea to steal the watch. and the money in there. But as he almost gets caught stealing the watch and the money, the Reverend heard two people outside singing Christmas carols, and one of them was pregnant. And the Reverend gives him $5, says, "Give it to them outside." And and then he goes out there and he gives them the money. He comes back inside, but he doesn't give them the watch. So then he's asking the Reverend and grandmother, "What happened between you and my mother?" No one would give him an answer. So the next day, he takes the watch and some money down to the pawn shop that he knew about, and one of the guys that he actually met in prison when he was arrested was there too. He goes to the pawn shop, shows him the watch, and the pawn shop guy knew whose watch it was. And he questioned him, "What the heck is this watch doing in your pocket? This is not your property." And the guy said to him, or the kid said to him, "I'm his grandson and he gave it to me," which early in the movie says you may give it to him. And the pawn guy says, "This is not something you pawn. The price is priceless and you hand it to your next generation. And if I know the Reverend well enough, he'd rather have this thing buried with him in his cold dead hand than allow this to ever be pawned." It was interesting, though, for a pawn shop perspective. That's not the average movie pawn shop guy. So he sends the kid back home, and then he meets the guy that was standing outside the pawn shop and asked him, "Oh, yeah, you're going to be straight from here on out, blah, blah, blah." And, sorry. He eventually asks the guy, says, "You can get anything, right?" He says, "What if I want a gun?" And this came out of left field. Like, what if I asked for a gun? And he says, meet me here at 10 o'clock. So he goes back to the grandfather's house. And then finally the grandfather calls him out, says, "Do you have some property in mind?" Now the grandfather has not been informed by the pawn shop. The grandfather just figured out the watch is missing and there's only one suspect for this. And he asks him, "Do you have some property in mind?" And the kid gives the watch back. No punishment. He says, "I expect to see you at church." And he actually said, Forrest Whitaker said a great thing here. He looked at the kid when he's like, "Oh, we're going to church." And he's like, "I'm not going to church." And he looks at him and says, "In this house, in my house, we go to church. Now, you have a choice on that. You either gonna do my house or what we do in my house or not." And then the kid turns around. He says, I'm waiting for your answer." And then he says, "Do you have some property in mind?" And the kid finally gives him watch and he says, "I'll see you in church then." It was a very interesting thing for him to just take it so lightly like that. But then later on we found out why. So anyway, the kid doesn't have any clothes at this point, so the grandmother has to open up one of his Christmas presents to get him clothes to go to church. So he goes from the gangster look to the preppy Nordstrom's look. This is like the richest Reverend I've ever seen. Or they're just old money and they just got it. So anyway, they go there and they go to the church, and the kid is at the church and he starts having dreams of everyone he has met at the church and his mother, and he's trying to figure out, trying to see the whole birth of Christ interpreted from his dreams on that and what he's been experiencing here, because this is a kid that hated Christmas because he never had joy in Christmas. And then he finally sees the birth of Christ, and he's out and he wakes up, and then he looks at his watch and it's 10 o'clock. So he has to meet the guy to get the gun. So he goes back to the pawn shop and meets the guy that he met in prison when he was arrested to get the gun. And then he goes in there and says, hey, do you have the gun? And the guy looks at him and says, what do you want it for? And he says, that's none of my business. And the kid's still trying to be hard, and this is a 15-year-old kid. And then the guy starts talking to him more, and then you find out later on that this guy is actually the kid's father. And with that interesting twist that this guy that you met your father first time in prison, on that he was out, and he says he's actually his father, and then the kid gets an attitude and actually points the gun at his father and says, give me the register, open up the safe. And then at this time, the New York Police Department drives by and sees this until pulls out a real gun and says, drop it. And the father screaming at them saying, this gun is unarmed, there's no bullets in this thing, this is my son, and we're having a heated argument on that. And then this one New York PD gets over there, looks over the kid, says, are you an idiot? I would have blown you, if it was anyone else in my department, I would have blown you away on that for this. And that's true. They would have. If you had a situation like that, they'd rather shoot you first than ask questions later. Even if the gun didn't have any bullets. They don't know that. So anyway, so the police drag the kid back to church. An interesting twist. And then as they drive him back, his mother shows up at the church because she's got nothing more to go to. So she's coming back to get the kid, the 15-year-old kid. But what you don't see is that the kid's father is riding the police car too. So they get out, and then the kid shows up, says, Mom, I'm glad you're here. He says, you got to come into church because a lot of things happened. So then what happens is she's like, I can't do it. He says, you have to do this. You have to face this because I got to know. So the kid goes into the church, and the reverend sees him, and so does his father, and the reverend sees him. And then eventually the mother comes in. And then it was basically a face-off. The parents of the 15-year-old kid and the grandparents. And he says, now someone's going to explain to me why this happened. And then you hear the whole story. And you find out the Reverend was not as squeaky clean innocent as you thought. And even he was guilty of not really of a crime, but more of a violation of trust. And then what happened is that because the violation of trust was discovered, I'm not really telling the exact story of what happened, because the way it was done, it basically broke his relationship with his only daughter. And now his grandson. Now the mother of the 15-year-old now wants to leave. And he's like, no. He's like, I had just found out I had all of this. I have an opportunity here. Do you think I'm going to go back to nothing and blow this? Are you out of your mind? He says, no, Mom, you are not ruining this to me. And this was interesting because he's a 15-year-old telling this in front of a congregation, in front of his grandparents. You are not going to ruin this. And then eventually you see things kind of work out in a weird way. It was actually an interesting plot. I'm not going to really release what was the circumstances there. You have to see the movie for yourself, but that's the general plot line. There wasn't a lot of humor, but the plot was actually very interesting. But there was way too much singing. But that's the main thing. I remember Rock, the other one, the one with Tom Cruise, that rock and roll one that was for Broadway, and they played like 10 different songs on that. A Rock of Ages, that's it. So anyway, this is Dinosaur. It's worth seeing it. I don't know if it's in theaters, but it may be a DVD rental or an Amazon instant. I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.